I just want to start with the point I made this morning, that the framework that we developed right at the beginning of the second tranche of the Natural Capital Committee was looking at natural capital in the sense of the stocks as a function of the extent and quality, the flows that you get from there, and then the public benefits that result from those ecosystem services or the flows. The other, when we did a assessment, and which was published last week, when in terms of the framework for measuring natural capital stocks, the take-home messages in terms of our current natural capital stocks is that first of all we should be focusing on conserving and enhancing natural capital stocks that underpin key ecosystem services, i.e. those that provide this societal benefit. But it's critical that we determine the extent, the condition and trend of these stocks. And when we looked and we did a sort of a overall scoping of the key natural capital assets in the UK and the data sets available, what became very clear is that there's some absolutely critical data gaps that we need to fill, both in terms of spatial resolution, temporal resolution, and also understanding the current condition of our natural capital stocks, be it air, freshwater, biota, land and marine data. We also made the point that the measurement of stocks should be at the systems level, i.e. that we should be looking at drainage basins in particular, or if we're thinking about when we're talking about the flood risks, for example, and a clear recognition that many stocks are in fact location dependent. And this is really critical when we think about biodiversity offsetting and other such policies. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the public goods that we get from nature, and then you look at the data input required for those stocks to model the flows, and then ask whether or not they're location dependent, the vast majority of them are. So we look at pollinated crops to start with. Well, pollinated crops, it's obviously dependent on the occurrence of pollinating species, insects, but also the habitats for foraging and nesting. Both of those could be anywhere. But the third thing that often gets missed when we start plotting good areas of pollinators is they have to be near crops that require pollination services. And I have to admit that the number of times I've seen pollinating mixes against fields that are wind pollinated, crops wind pollinated. CO2 sequestration, this is not it's not location dependent, whereas go down that list, flood risk protection again is, as I showed this morning. Clean air, particularly in cities, we need to be thinking about urban trees and tree species and height. All of these things are important. Clean water, again, location dependent, and thriving wildlife sometimes, but not always, because of course a lot of wildlife can actually and does actually move around. Right, so moving on then. Once you have an assessment of the stocks, what additional data considerations are required? And I want to go right the way back to the Lawton report in 2009, which made the point that we need our natural capital assets need to be bigger, better and more joined up. And then there's the statement in the 25-year plan, which has been mentioned a number of times this morning, which is that we need to leave the environment in a better state than it is at present. And underpinning all of these, what's come through is a number of different policies that are being worked through right now in the pending Environment Bill, and things like the Nature Recovery Networks, the Net Environmental Gain Bill and the ELM scheme. So taking all of those together then, the question and what data and approaches we need is first of all the question, where and what should be enhanced to improve our natural capital stocks once we know where they are, and then where and what natural capital stocks should be joined up. Because it's only by taking those two questions can we really start to properly underpin some of these policies like the ELMS policies, the net biodiversity gain and the nature recovery networks. So let's start first of all with where and what to join up. So I want to go back to the example I gave this morning, which is the Evenlode catchment in Oxfordshire. And I give this example because it's quite a simple one. And what I showed this morning, through the modelling approaches, you can work out where within that catchment, and this is a drainage basin catchment that feeds directly into Oxford, And if you get storm surges in this catchment, that's when you flood downstream in Oxford. And by modelling the hydrological pattern in this catchment and looking at the soils and the vegetation cover, you can see areas on that landscape in blue, which provide a high reduction in surface water runoff, and areas in red, which act like bare soil. But your question really is, if you're paying money for elms and you want to actually get local landowners to enhance their landscape to reduce flood risk in Oxford, where should you be paying for those elm schemes to take place? And this comes back to, again, thinking a bit more about that drainage basin catchment. And in here, this second slide shows you that if you calculate your travel times through the networks, what you find is the land which is to the northeast of Oxford is much more important to have your elm schemes going on there and pay farmers and landowners to plant trees than going much further west. If you pay to plant trees in the west, they're not going to have much impact on flood risk in Oxford. So it's very, very spatially dependent. But then your next question is, well, how much effect will you have from planting trees? And so again, this comes back to then thinking about the approaches you need to take are very much underpinned by the science, but also starting to set those scenarios. And so in this example, which is work done by Becky Wilbur, she reran the hydrological models, but adding in trees. So she's got at the top left-hand corner a 5% forest, and then 10% forest, and then 20% forest. So if you changed your land cover, what does that do to your flow down into Oxford? And so when she did this work, what she showed, there are 4 catchments which measure, they're gauge catchments, they measure the flow coming into Oxford. You've got the Thames at Farnmore, Cherwell at Enslow Mill, Evenlode at Cassington Mill, and Ray at Islip. And each of those lines, the darkest blue line is 20% forest. So this is effectively a reduction in discharge if it's below the line. And what you see is with 5%, you get a small amount of reduction. With 10%, you get a greater amount of reduction. And with 20%, you start to get a significant reduction in flood risks during storm events if you plant that percentage of trees in the areas that we've shown. So this is then, you've got a much clearer evidence base to be able to go back to those landowners and actually start to pay public money for the public good that those trees are providing in terms of reducing your flood risk. So it's not being top down and then telling people what to do, but it is starting to put an evidence base in place so that the money that's paid is the scenario that's been predicted is actually going to have an outcome that we want to have. But there's another thing in here. It's not just about flood risk, as we've talked about this morning and has come through over the last 7 years in the Natural Capital Committee. The point is, if you start to conserve particular aspects of nature, in fact, you can get multiple benefits from the same asset. So I just want to take this example just to make this point. So if you've got your tree planting, let's say the elm scheme kicks in and your farmers or your landowners in that area are paid to plant these trees. You're not only going to get water flow regulation and reduction of flood risk in Oxford, what you'll also get there, if you plant tree species that are fast growing and good for CO2 sequestration, you're going to get your atmospheric and your carbon regulation in there. You'll also get soil erosion protection. If you add features that enhance your biodiversity, such as pollination-friendly flower mixes and bat boxes, then you'll get your thriving wildlife on top of that. And finally, if you start to add features that increase recreational potential of this environment, then also you're getting the added benefits in there of physical and mental well-being. And each of those benefits carries with it an economic value. Each of those benefits is a public good. And so therefore, by starting to think about, first of all, your spatially constrained assets, but then layer on top those other ones, you can start to get a really powerful argument for why you should be paying public money for the public good, in this case planting trees north of Oxford. But what about bigger, better and more joined up? Do we do this at the sort of just generally hoping that we're going to somehow this is going to happen across the UK landscape by more and more people being inspired, or rather, can we help that process as well? And this is something that I think is start to think about what are the next approaches we need to be thinking about in order to do this. This is one that all ecologists back away from, many biodiversity scientists back away from this as well. But I think there are some really interesting things coming through right now, which I do think will start to help. First of all, though, as we talked about before, we do need a baseline understanding of the current levels of fragmentation and fragment size and condition. So as we're talking about this morning, that very much that top-down approach, what does England look like in terms of fragmented landscape, be it grasslands or be it woodlands? The second one then is we need to establish where is the optimum location for joining up similar types of fragment. So again, a top-down approach. And then finally, once you've worked out where those locations are, this is where you absolutely have to bring in the financial incentives via ELMS, via the nature recovery networks to really to encourage the joining of those gaps. And for example, planting forests in specific locations where you know you are starting to join up that nature network. So I think this is really then looking forwards. There are many models and approaches to enable these steps to now occur, and this is the time really to embrace these, to make sure that we are getting and taking a really scientific approach towards doing this. And I'll just give a couple of examples here. So the first one, for a long time there's been some very good modelling approaches out there where you can look at a landscape, look at the land cover types, and model or at least understand which are the biggest fragments on that landscape. And there's now new models coming out where, and this is somebody did this for me the other day, where if you look at this graph here of southwestern England, what you can see is this is native forest fragments in southwest England. And so actually for the whole of England now, this model was run, and all those little, you might not see it, I'll focus in here. Right, so that slight patchy area, you see the river going, the boundary in the river going down there. You see that darker blue patch, that's the Forest of Dean. And go deeper, and then you can see those are the fragments of native forest around in the Forest of Dean. And all of that has been done using land cover maps and then running this FragStats program. So the first step then is identifying where those fragments are. So let's say you wanted to then join those up and start to do a network to join up the forest patches across this area. Well, the next approach is then to use this other modelling approach that's come through, which is graph theory. So graph theory is a modelling approach where it basically views each fragment as a point, and it looks for the optimal connections between a network of points connected by lines. So it's been used by conservation biologists in the last couple of years, and you'll see this one paper here where they've redefined wildlife corridors in Belize in Central America by using graph theory. So you'll see the grey lines, you see the red if you look at the graph on the right hand side, you've got the red, which are the actual current protected areas, and then the grey hatched areas in there are the areas they think would be best for creating a more joined up environment. So, the final then to do this, is this possible in the UK? Absolutely. So this was using that same approach, and we just did it for southwest England, and we used another graph theory. It's the same approach where it's called the integral index of connectivity. It uses graph theory. It takes those forest fragments, and it works out which ones are the largest, which ones are in key positions, and then how do you join them together. And what it's showing in here, the patches that you see flagged up in red are really important parts of the landscape that if you're going to plant trees to connect native forest, that is where you'd plant them. So I've just given you that example to show you that these things, it doesn't have to all be a qualitative. You can actually take these quantitative approaches, but then at the next point is to start to discuss with the local landowners and the bottom-up approaches as to how you then deliver those connectivity points in there. So I'm just trying to get my slider to work again. Sorry, I've lost the connection. Here we go. Right, so the summary advice then from the NCC on data requirements and approaches. First of all, I think this is a point we need to keep making, is that the ability to map, measure, conserve and enhance England's natural capital assets is well and truly within our grasp. And 10 years ago, I would not have said the same, but there's been a huge shift in the way that we're working in terms of data sets and modelling. And by doing so, we have a real opportunity to leave the environment in a much better state for generations to come. But we do need to be quantitative and scientific in our approaches and use the best models, tools and data sets to provide these outputs. There's still far too much, I feel there's still an awful lot of sort of pushback thinking that we can do this stuff with a very qualitative approach and that will do. I really don't think it will do. We really do need to be thinking very, very strategically now about what and where to plant in order to achieve these outcomes that we are all so in support of. I think many of the approaches, and we had a number of questions came back this morning when we talked about it, that people want it to be bottom up because it is landscapes they are on, and more often not they own. Absolutely, it's not telling people how to do it, but it is we need to be able to give a framework and to have those tools and technologies and model outputs that then people can use to make informed decisions. But the other point I'd really urge right now is that we don't become so tied up in unnecessary complexity as to make the whole approach only accessible to a few. So we do need to have platforms and tools where people can easily download this data without having to know the great details that are within those models. And then this is very much a pitch into the next two talks, really, because I am firmly of the opinion that without citizen scientists and NGOs, we're not going to be able to deliver on any of this. We absolutely need to bring in much needed buy-in and data collection approaches and delivery to make all of this possible.